Hello, everybody. Welcome back to an exciting episode of the Natural Awakening podcast with me, your host, Whiston, and today's special guest is Charlie, founder of Evolving Ground and all-around interesting person. Charlie, would you say just a little bit about yourself for people who may not know who you are?
Thank you, Wisdom. That's a lovely introduction. I'm Charlie Awbery. I have co-founded Evolving Ground with my friend and mate Jared James, and we've been going for 3 years now. So we're like the new kids on the block. We're just beyond toddler age, and yeah, Evolving Ground is a community of practice for people interested in a contemporary Vajrayana. I have a traditional Vajrayana background. I was with the Aro lineage, Nyingma Buddhism, for, I guess, more than 20 years, actually, probably. Started in the mid-90s. So yeah, that's a little bit about my background and what I'm up to at the moment.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. And we're going to get a little bit more into that background starting now. So if we could just fill us in a little bit with some biographical details. Where were you born? What was your early life like? And then, threading that through, how were you initially drawn to Dharma, to Vajrayana, Dzogchen, and the rest?
Yeah. So I'm from the UK, as you can probably tell by my accent. I was born in London. My family moved to Yorkshire when I was about 4. And so I grew up in Yorkshire, in the countryside, just outside of York. Had a very rural, lovely upbringing there. I went to school near York, and let me see, I moved to Wales and I was working with Amnesty International in let's say my mid-late 20s, I think it was. So initially, when I got interested in Buddhism, I had been abroad, spent some time in India, learned meditation there in my early 20s, and had extraordinary experiences, really revelatory, very impactful, very formative experiences for me, just intense meditation. And that galvanized me to start looking around. So while I was in Cardiff, keeping down a normal job, I was looking and seeking, I guess, going around different groups, spending some time with different Tibetan groups, Zen group. I eventually landed on the Aro, and I took teachers who were Lamas Norton and Erdzin in Cardiff, and had a lovely small sangha with them. We had lots of fun retreats, camping retreats, very happy memories of that time. Also took Nakcha Rinpoche, Khandro Dayton as my teachers, and eventually I became ordained, took Tantric, Samaya, and became ordained in... Actually, it's not exactly an Aro ordination, interestingly. It's a Nakpa Nakpa ordination, the Nakpang Sangha ordination that I took, and that was in 2002. So I stayed within a traditional context, practicing Yidam, Chud, all of the usual tantric practices, Dzogchen inflected tantric practices, all the way through to 2018. And I left the tradition at that point, and had absolutely no intention of setting anything up or going down the route that eventually evolved with Evolving Ground. So I was all set to go into tech work, to just have my meditation practice and enjoy my own practice and my meditation sitting. So everything that transpired with Evolving Ground really was unintentional to begin with. It happened organically. It grew out of an interest that Jared and I shared, and then we shared that with others, and a community formed, and here we are.
Here you are, evolving.
Yeah, here we are, evolving, yeah.
That's yeah. That was an excellent narrative thread. Maybe we could zoom in a little bit. And you use some terms that maybe some of our listeners won't be familiar with. So
Okay.
what is a yidam? What is chud? And maybe you could explain a little what makes Vajrayana or Dzogchen, and those are slightly, well, depending on who you ask, slightly or very different. Maybe you could just nuance or detail that a little bit for people who aren't familiar with some of the vocabulary we're using.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting in itself because Vajrayana is vast. It's an aspect of Buddhism. It's the yana part of that is path. So you could see it as a general overall path within Buddhism, but within that there are many sub-paths or many different views, developments, histories. So Vajrayana is this thunderbolt path. It's maybe sometimes referred to as being the fast path. It's very energetic, lots of energized practice. It is one way that I like to characterize it is that Tantric practice, so you can think of Vajrayana as including Tantra, Dzogchen, Mahamudra. There are different strands. One way that I like to think about Tantric practice is that you are moving from emptiness. A lot of Buddhism is emphasizing emptiness and moving towards emptiness. So you're moving from emptiness back into form, into activity, into energized relationship with the world. So that's a way of understanding Vajrayana. It's not the only way, but most Vajrayana practices they're going to be involving, or tantric practices, Buddhist tantra is going to be involving activity, form, energy in some way.
Engagement with the senses, not
renunciation
and withdrawal.
Yeah.
And in my background, I did a lot of early Buddhist or Theravadan style practice, which focuses on cultivation of really quite extreme sensory withdrawal, absorption into concentrated states. And that, well, for most people, that is not so compatible with an active and engaged lifestyle outside of a retreat context. I mean, well, there's more I could say there, but so I think for a lot of people, more engaged non-renunciate paths within the contemporary cultural context, whether that's Zen, Vajrayana, Dzogchen, Mahamudra, etc., that holds a much more vividness for people. There's something they can see themselves in that path, taking that path, rather than I can't go off into the forest and renounce my worldly life. Are you kidding?
I love the terminology that you're using, non-renunciative, vividness, all of that relationship with the sense fields. We use, in Evolving Ground, we use life-affirming path. So it's non-renunciative. It's you're engaging with your emotions, not withdrawing from emotional resonance. You're engaging with vision, with your visual field. A lot of the practices in Dzogchen, they're using your focal mechanism or using eyes. You're bringing your senses into your practice, bringing your emotions into your practice as a way of changing and transforming relationship.
Yeah, which changing and transforming relationship, I'm sure. I know that sounds good to me, and I imagine for most people as well, that changing and transforming the relationship to the senses, to the sense of oneself, one's environment, bringing that within practice and not pushing that all away. And the experience I have in early Buddhism, I'm kind of making a caricature of it to facilitate the discussion. It's more nuanced than that, but
yeah, for sure. And you can bring renunciation into a Vajrayana understanding, into a Vajrayana system as well. You would review that as being your base, your capacity to have some space around reactivity, emotional reactivity, or bring some space into context. So it's not that we're necessarily renouncing renunciation, but reframing it. Yeah. Reframing it and looking at the value of renunciation from a different perspective, looking at how it functions in different contexts.
Yeah, So if I'm understanding right, renunciation may still be a skillful aspect in a conventional sense to undertake for certain people at certain times in certain contexts. And you're not,
absolutely.
I love that phrase. We're not renouncing renunciation.
Right, right. We may be using a different terminology or renouncing the universality of renunciation and relativizing it.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
I'm familiar with, no specific quote is coming up to mind right now, but in classical texts, the true meaning of renunciation is non-grasping or recognition of the mind's nature. That's real renunciation. It doesn't matter what's going on in the sense fields.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess you could see Vajrayana as becoming interested again in the senses and what is happening in the body, and having the body as a locus of practice. Yeah.
I think that's a good portal into talking a little bit more about yidam practice or chud, the body being a locus of transformation, of perception, of relationship. So maybe you could speak a little more to that for those who don't know so much.
So yidam, and translation or a kind of very rough understanding of yidam that I like is awareness being, awareness person, if you like, in a body of awareness. Yidams are traditionally they would be considered magical beings, visionary beings. They're symbolic of particular qualities or ways of being. So, for example, you have Taras. They're yidams. They're embodying compassion. Green Tara, white Tara, the family of Taras. You might have Yeshisogil, Padmasambhava as yidam practices. So a practitioner would engage with a yidam in one way or another. There are many different yidam practices, many different ways of engaging as well. So a practitioner would have a yidam practice. They may have a sadhana in relation to that, which is a preparatory setup. You're setting up your context, your framework. Or they may just go straight into embodiment of yidam, and self-arising yidam. So there are very different ways of approaching yidam practice, but it's the core Buddhist tantric practice, yidam. So if you're practicing a set of preliminaries towards Tantra, you would end with yidam practice. That would be your core practice, and you'd be engaging then on the path of Tantra.
Yeah. And there's a thread I wanna pull on here, because what I've seen in kind of the online Dharma communities and also in person, among some of my social circles, is that some of the, traditionally more advanced, more esoteric, formless meditation practice, Dzogchen, Mahamudra, or at least certain aspects of Dzogchen, that is more easily palatable. But if you bring in awareness beings or meditating on oneself as a deity in skull and bone ornaments, in a charnel ground, whoa. Which is kind of an interesting reversal
Yeah.
of the more traditional structure, wherein, well, I mean, it varies, but maybe you could speak to that. Why, and what you've observed in your own social circles. Mahamudra or Dzogchen is also like more widely taught than a lot of the yidam practices. I don't know. I'd be curious any observations or comments you have on that odd phenomenon.
Yeah. You could think of it as flavors. Like Dzogchen has a very different flavor to tantric practice. Now, often Dzogchen is presented from the perspective of sutra, which is our renunciative style of Buddhism. So it can look and feel quite similar to sutra. It can seem like a sort of a movement on from sutra to incorporate non-dual awareness, or a movement into non-meditation, do nothing. So very often Dzogchen is presented as meditation without formal sitting boundaries, or a different style of opening meditation, very open to everything that is going on in the sense fields, as opposed to a renouncing, cutting off. So I think the most common perception of what Dzogchen is like big, big completion, great perfection is another translation. So it's got this kind of sense of vastness, of bigness, of wholeness to it, and usually it's presented in that kind of way. But it's interesting. I mean, Dzogchen itself has many different developments. It's a whole historical strand development. Eventually, it reincorporates elements of Tantra as well. So depending on where and how you encounter Dzogchen, you're going to have really quite a different sense of even what that means. So, yeah, it's interesting. There's so many different colorful strands within Vajrayana. Yeah. Where should we go with this? So Dzogchen in relation to Tantra is interesting. Dzogchen can incorporate a lot of energy. It can be very energetic indeed. So if you approach Dzogchen from a tantric background, tantric perspective, you're not necessarily being very quiet or sitting in a, it doesn't quite have that
quiet, humble
that
yogi in their cave retreat.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily have that sutric flavor at all. It can be highly energized, quite involved. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your relationship with Dzogchen?
Well, I've I did some bootleg Dzogchen for a while. That's one way of putting it.
Bootleg Dzogchen. I love that phrase. I love that.
Reading a lot of Dzogchen texts and philosophy, making connections through texts with teachers like Pachol Rinpoche, Jigme Lingpa, the Longchen Intig, and also reading a lot of Bon Dzogchen materials, which and at that point in my practice, which at that point was mostly based within more early Buddhist frameworks, with also I would describe earlier phases of my practice as kind of in structure and formal meditation, following early Buddhist or Theravadan techniques, but within a more Zen or Mahayana aspiration. So, considering bodhicitta important, not looking to transcend samsara permanently and enjoy cessation of the aggregates forever. That kind of never really appealed to me. However, just for whatever idiosyncratic reasons, I found early Buddhist and Theravadan meditation methods expedient. So then when I started to have quite a lot of experiences, and then with the little reading I had done within Dzogchen Mahamudra, the Tantric sphere, experiences began to arise that were like, oh, whoa, that's, So some resonance sounded there. And suddenly what I was reading in Dzogchen Mahamudra or Tantric texts, commentaries, that resonated and made much more sense of what I was experiencing.
Made sense, right? That's very interesting. A lot of people that I speak to have that kind of experience. They're approaching, for example, opening awareness, which is Evolving Ground's foundational meditation. They're approaching opening awareness and they hear sentences or phrases about the kind of experience that it can lead to, and they're like, yeah, I'll just keep on practicing. I'll use a technique, try different systems, try different practices. But all of that sounds a little bit wishy-washy or woo, or doesn't connect to something that I can describe experientially. And then a couple of years down the line, they're like, "Boomf."
Yeah.
Oh, that phrase now makes sense in a way that wasn't previously accessible. So there is this kind of relationship with meditation, relationship with evolving practice, that certain phrases that seem somehow not pertinent then become relevant at different times of practice. And that's lovely. It's great because it's a sign that your practice is maturing and growing and changing.
Yeah, I remember I remember quotes out of context, unfortunately, often, but someone saying that, as you progress, you realize more and more that the metaphors are not metaphors. They're speaking directly and as literally as possible.
Yeah.
But to kind of fill out the picture, now I am undertaking more formal Vajrayana and Dzogchen practice under lineage teachers within the Nyingma. Yeah.
Fantastic.
So I love the traditional trappings is the wrong word. It makes it kind of pejorative. But I love the traditional iconography, the ritual. I get
So
into
do
it.
I. Yeah. I have a great fondness for the Tibetan cultural forms that Vajrayana is presented in. I love that. It doesn't appeal to everybody, and I think especially if you are these days, if you're approaching a practice, there's so much available, there's so much to navigate that it's very difficult to immediately dive into one single system and to say, okay, right, I'm going to take on the tantric preliminaries. I'm going to go through this yidam practice and complete it 100,000 times. I'm going to do my prostrations or whatever. Like, why would you do that without already having had quite a bit of experience or introduction? And so having a kind of multi-systemic, meta-systemic approach seems pretty important these days, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if, especially if you connect through online in some variant. It's just a fire hose of information from all traditions across all different historical.
So much available. How do you navigate that? What do you do with all that? What's relevant? What isn't relevant? Yeah.
And for me, undertaking in teaching, going through the teaching certification process of Shinzen's system, I found Shinzen Young pretty early on, and his kind of metasystemic approach just instantly clicked. And now I spend a little bit of my time these days. I'm a little too busy to do it very much, but I teach Shinzen's system. So for my personal practice, it's mostly grounded within the traditional Vajrayana and Dzogchen path. And then I'm happy to bring forth whatever I can through Shinzen's,
That's wonderful. That's amazing. Yeah, we have, in Evolving Ground, we have quite a few people who are Shinzen fans or coming via that system. And that's lovely.
I don't want to toot my own or Shinzen's horn too much, but it is deep and broad, as deep as anything you'll find in the traditional forms, but it's quite stripped bare. It doesn't have any of the trappings, which I love. But as far as technique and principles and practices go, it will take you to the same no place. I can verify.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we've said enough to give people the general sense of what yidam practice could be, although there is this traditional division between generation and completion stage or phase, different translation practices, with one more visual and one more somatic, if you like. And I don't know if you'd like to say something about that.
Yeah, in the Aroter, the emphasis is on what you would call, from the Nyingma school perspective, that's Anu Yoga, so that's more like completion phase. And so not all, but most of the Yidam practice that I engaged with was in Anu Yoga style, which is self-arising. So you become the Yidam, and it's highly energetic. And depending on what system you're practicing within, you'd have different kinds of visualization. In the Aroter, that practice is very much oriented towards a felt sense. So it's a more like a generic felt sense of the qualities of the Yidam.
So less emphasis on
have
the
very direct
minute detail.
Visualization. Yeah.
And is as well, from the reading that I've done and the little experience I have, there's also more of an emphasis in the self-arising yidam practice on wrathful manifestations, bringing in kind of that energy.
Can be.
Can be.
Yeah, it wouldn't necessarily be. You could practice self-arising in a peaceful form, joyous form as well. Yeah. I mean, you could systematize it such that your peaceful orientation is more external, and then your joyous orientation is you're establishing more of a connection. I mean, there are very different ways. If you understand the principle of how different Yidam practice works within a different view, and if you understand how any particular yidam practice is supposed to function, then you can relate to yidam in a like, oh, it doesn't have to be, this practice has to be done in this very strict way that is connected to this particular vehicle or view. You can actually understand the function and then relate to yidam in that way. So, for example, like Padmasambhava, major figure in Tibetan Buddhism, was a historical figure as well as being practiced as yidam, comes in many different forms. You could relate with Padmasambhava as peaceful yidam, or as a joyful yidam, or as a wrathful yidam. So,
I mean, I think that's one of the things that people, including me, find so enticing about Vajrayana is the panoply of practices and options and exploration that is there in all of these different forms and manifestations and colors and
It's so colorful.
And there's a thread that earlier that I wanted to pull that you brought up, the kind of the view from within which you undertake a yidam practice can inform the flexibility and the experience you have within it. So I know in the Aeroter, everything is kind of inflected with Dzogchen. So maybe you could say something about engaging yidam practice within, kind of that Dzogchen inflection.
Right. Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm not representing the Aeroter. I've left the Aeroter, so I'm not a representative of their Sangha. I want to be clear about that. So if anyone's listening and you want to find out more, the Aeroter have many online events and many teachers in different locations, and I recommend just going and finding out for yourself. So, but I can say from my experience in the Aeroter that the presentation is that everything is based from the perspective of Dzogchen. So you would practice yidam, you practice that within a Dzogchen holding view, if you like. You could practice any vehicle, any yana, with the view of Dzogchen. And when you do that, when you engage in that way, then your practice has a different flavor. It has a different, it's going to look and feel quite different to, for example, you starting from a set of tantric preliminaries and practicing within a highly tantrified lineage. That may be much more systematic. It may be much more like progressive. Dzogchen is really non-progressive in its overall nature. It doesn't take a cultivating, generating, well, depending on which Dzogchen lineage you're in, it may have incorporated some of that, but the general sense of the practice is that the base, the path, the fruit are all within a same view. They're coming from the same perspective, and you are eventually the base is no different from the fruit. Saṃsāra, the cycle of existence and suffering, is no different from the liberated way of being and understanding. They're inseparable. So it's a question of finding and understanding and seeing how that is in one's practice in the moment. And so if everything is inflected with Dzogchen, then that is going to pervade all of your practice. It's going to pervade the way that you approach your yidam practice, your meditation practice, your relationships in life.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was such a holistic vision. I'm left wordless. The yam of non-thought. Maybe we could say a little bit more, or you could circle back and nuance more if you like. Because there is so much variety even within Dzogchen. The classical division, Semde, Longde, Menakde, with kind of progressive reincorporation and utilization of earlier tantric elements to the practice and practices of visions as well. And I think this is a lesser known aspect within kind of what I've seen in online discourse of Dharma, just the the richness, nuance, and variety that is within the tradition. So maybe you could speak to that a little.
What are you thinking about? Where are you? What's resonating for you? Like you mentioned, Sem day, long day, Menak day.
I guess
Those are the three.
because
Yeah.
this is I suppose coming out of my own personal engagement. I've been, because of a kind of a draw towards the colorful and the bombastic and the wow, impressive, the bells and whistles.
That's very tantric, yeah.
Yeah.
That's very tantric flavor. And some of the later Dzogchen like reincorporates the Yidam, or reincorporates that kind of activity, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess for me that has manifested in seeking out teachers of in the Menak Day stream that incorporates practices of vision. Whereas, as I understand it, earlier there's a historical development here, but earlier strata of the Dzogchen teaching, in some ways it's very similar, though the historical connection, as I've read, is not so well delineated. Very similar to formless meditation practices that you'd find in Chan, where there's no meditation, no cultivation of anything whatsoever.
Wandering yogis in the mountains. Yeah, I'm very attracted to that aspect of Dzogchen. I love the natural environment practices, the relationship with the elements, like the literal elements, the practices that involve water, wind, being in the elements. That kind of natural relationship with the environment, non-monastic, outside of the institutionalized setting. That's always been very appealing to me, and that is more associated with the earlier Dzogchen traditions, with the Sem day traditions. Also, I love Long Day, which is the second development in Dzogchen. A lot of that was lost, but you would associate more physical movement practices, yogic systems, embodied yoga systems with Long Day, and that has been a big element of my practice. I teach Dzogchen movement class, and developing a whole system for evolving ground that involves really quite lovely, gentle movements that are the way that they function is that they open up your experience of the senses, so that you begin to have you experience moving sensation around the body, very blissful or clear sensations in the body, and then that can be an aspect of practice. You can have that relationship between clarity and spaciousness and openness in the body as a way to indicate, to lead to clarity in mind as well.
And that's something that it's actually shared, interestingly. I in my own practice, I've done a fair bit of jhana practice. So in certain ways that is taught, that's all about bringing bliss into the body and letting that calm the formations of both body and mind, and seeing this kind of through line of refinement or so transformation of perception of the body that opens out into a different view of life. This kind of somatic aspect that I just love to hear you talk about the somatic aspect and bringing that in through different modalities. It's just a delight to see how many different ways in there are.
Yeah, it's interesting. You use the word refinement, and I associate refinement with the jhana series in early Buddhism, the progressive series of you could say refinement of relationship with the senses. So you move through the jhanas, and your experience of your body is increasingly subtle and refined, until at a certain point you pop and there is no sensation, or you're not in the field of sensation. So I'm really interested in the way that the experience of the body changes as you move into tantric practice and Vajrayana as a whole. And what is that relationship between the sensations that occur with jhana practice, and then how do they, are they relevant in Vajrayana? What happens? What happens? There's a whole field of exploration there around subtle, what you might call subtle sensation, which is non-ordinary. It's not, most people walking around don't experience waves of bliss or whatever. So one of the ways that I characterize the difference is that you're not introspective in the same way as you would be with jhana practice. You're becoming more and more and more introspective. So I use this word extrospective, and your view is outward looking. So you're not getting to a point where you're kind of I'm thinking of what the terminology you're not getting to a point where you're refining so much that you're sort of polished and there's nothing left. You're moving in a different direction, which is liberating. You're allowing sensation to move of its own accord, to be liberated from the way that we usually constrain sensation. So it's a movement outward, and the connection with context and environment is reflective. They're kind of imprints, so you could have the kind of experience that your context is informing the way that you experience your body and what all is going on in your field of sensation. And because you have that relationship with practice, and you've opened your sense fields, then a lot more is possible in terms of the way that you relate in an embodied way with your environment. So you might have, like, for example, piti in the jhanas. That's your experience of your first jhana. It's quite intense, right? There's a lot going on there. You have it's lovely, and it's like can be really quite extraordinarily intense, and lots of movement of sensation, and very blissful, very it feels nice, right? It feels good. That kind of
nice
sensation,
jacuzzi.
yeah. So that sort of sensation is absolutely like par for the course in Dzogchen long day movements, and you're not relating to that in a special kind of way so as to allow it to morph into something else.
Mm-hmm.
It's you simply experience that as moving sensation. You might experience sukha is also sort of connected with your second jhana. So that in a Dzogchen context, that becomes dewa and just clarity, bliss. There's much more of a sort of lighter sensation there. But these are not set in progressive relation with each other. They're a word that's used in Dzogchen. It's ornamental. It's like you experience sensation as an ornament of being, and it comes and goes and moves and liberates itself of itself. There's no sense that you're wanting to channel it into an intense force such that it's going disappears eventually. I mean, and that's but yeah, often kind of comes and goes into just the non-conceptual empty state. So those things can be simultaneously present. They're not seen as you're moving towards one from another.
And yeah, that's been an interesting feature of my own practice, given my background, and then moving to these tantric practices and Dzogchen, non-conceptual meditation, resting without, with minimal or no involvement. And then, I don't know, maybe my neurophysiology has been primed for, in Tibetan context, what would be called these nyams. But the engagement with them, or rather, there is no engagement with them, and yet still things unfold and self-liberate, to use the technical term, which has just been a delight.
Yeah, it is. It's lovely.
Ornaments of the natural state. That's I mean, that's another thing that I love, both about Zen, which is why I've done training in there, but also within Dzogchen in the tantric context, the way they use not only imagery and iconography, but language to evoke the
Yeah.
experiences. Yeah.
Yeah. Language has been really important for me in making the transition from a traditional context into a contemporary exploration. Something that in Evolving Ground we do a lot of is uh, looking at the way that we're languaging our experience and seeing if we can find a shared language that isn't kind of set and prescribed. So, for example, one of the things I love about Tibetan language is that it's has these word clusters. You'll have a syllable and it changes according to context. It has a particular kind of meaning or inflection that is related to the context within which it's used. So people who speak Tibetan, they understand what a word means from the whole relationship with the conversation, the sentence, the everything that's there in the moment. And having that kind of broad, nebulous meaning associated with a word. I love that. So you're not saying, oh, it only has this meaning, and there is some kind of inherent fixed meaning in the word itself, in the syllable itself. So we're doing that with English in Evolving Ground. We're having a word cluster or a whole kind of field of language around an experience that we can then move around in order to help each other or explain the kind of effect that a particular technique might have, or the felt sense. Somebody's going to be using some terms in a very different way to others, and some will resonate, some will be less available. So I love that. I love that relationship with language. It seems really important. The
And a
way that
playfulness.
yeah, exactly. And the way that you language your practice actually affects what your practice is going to be, especially over years. So if you're using renunciative language like detachment, non-attachment, letting go is quite renunciative, then you're going to have a renunciative kind of experience. If you're using finding, noticing, finding, involvement, you're going to have a very different sort of bodily experience eventually from your practice. So I think paying attention to what language you use when you're reflecting, what language you use when you're talking about your practice actually has an effect. It has an
Yeah.
experiential effect.
Yeah, that's been interesting. That it's hitting a lot of resonant notes over here. Just reflecting, looking at things I wrote years ago, or kind of comparing the thought
Oh, yeah.
patterns I have now in relation to, say, 5 years ago. Quite different. Quite different.
Yeah. It's amazing how
Um,
fast things can change as well when you just swap out a language. Yeah. What do you
yeah.
notice? What do you see?
There's an emphasis now much more on delight and appreciation,
Hmm.
whereas before it was much more. I have to be a very good practitioner, very diligent,
Right.
very stern, very strict.
Hmm. Big difference.
The straight and narrow kind of. Okay, I've got this practice. It's set up like this. It's linear. It's sequential. And here's this straitjacket. I'm putting myself in, and we're going full speed ahead to the
Yes.
destination. Let's go.
Yeah.
And I could get at a conceptual
Right.
level
Right.
how that might be constrictive or not actually in accord with the way that things are, and yet, well, causes and conditions. That's how things played out.
Isn't there always this tension between the discipline, the gradual, the progressive path, and then the oh no, it's just here all the time. It's always already available. There you go. And then there's this kind of no, no, no. You've got to have some kind of the vigilante. I like that term, the vigilante or the policeman mind. That my co-founder Jared, he has moved from more of a disciplined, highly disciplined practice into more of an open, responsive practice. And both of those can be valuable. You can go to one extreme and then be a little hard on yourself, or a little over disciplined, or you can just become like a lazy slob or whatever. So those are the failure modes of each of those extreme polarities, if you like. But yeah, I mean,
And
obviously, if you put in the hours of practice, that's going to make a difference. Uh, And if you become overly rigid, then yeah, that could have too many constraints. It could cause some pain or suffering as well. So yeah, got
Which
to
for
have
me
a
it
bit of
certainly
common
did.
sense. Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
some emotional dissociation and
Right.
excellent,
Yeah.
A plus spiritual bypassing. Um, yeah. Well, we don't have to go into that, but I'm familiar with those failure modes. But to kind of just add to everything that you said, there's also discipline and playfulness aren't actually they aren't necessarily opposites. You
Exactly.
can
Yeah. Yeah.
practice and play within a very rigid structure. I'm thinking of my recent experience in Zen monastic residency. You can
Hmm.
exist within an extremely rigid structure of
Right.
total silence and many hours of sitting a day, and actually
Hmm.
have that just be
And
continuous
still have a
playful delight.
lightness. Yeah. Right. Right. Still have a lightness, a playfulness in your attitude. Yeah.
Right.
So attitude is really important. It's especially important as you move into tantric practice and different ways of being, different kinds of attitude become available. So you're not having a universal, overall Buddhist attitude or maybe not even such a virtuous attitude. You're not aiming towards a way of understanding the world in terms of virtue or non-virtue, but a lot more variety becomes available. It's not that that is not important in some circumstances, but there's this whole kind of variety of relationship and ways of relating. Yeah.
Yeah. I know in
Mm.
earlier phases, and these kinds of fixations will still arise. There can be quite a kind of moralistic bent.
Mm. Mm. And towards oneself as well. I've seen that
Yeah,
a
and
lot. That
yeah.
that one can, it's very easy to get into a mode of being quite hard on yourself, and so it's also useful. I mean, it's valuable to know that you can discipline yourself in a particular way, that you can uh, go into a structure of practice and maintain that and stick to that without just simply going with whatever you feel like in the moment. So one of the ways of misinterpreting or misunderstanding Dzogchen is, oh, I just do what I feel when I feel, and yeah, and that's could be equally limiting as uh, turning yourself into a draconian disciplinarian and imposing that on others as well. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
So
it's
yeah,
almost like we're saying
attitude,
there's no
appreciation.
absolutes. That's oh
Yes. Yes. And that is not quite so traditional, because within a traditional context you do have absolutes, you do have ultimate realities, you do have absolute metaphysics or views, worldviews. So I think that's something that contemporary culture, contemporary society can bring, that can relieve the anxiety a little bit, or the relieve the sense that it has to be all or nothing. My path has to be this way, or one single system, and that is the right one, that is the true one. And that's actually, in principle, that's baked into Dzogchen anyway, that meta systematic approach. But very specifically, that would be in relation to vehicles, to yanas. You approach other people's practice, or you approach a yana as a way that can lead to a particular endpoint that is not necessarily the same as another one. So that's kind of built into Dzogchen, but it's still within that particular metaphysical worldview that ultimately we're getting to the great perfection, the best one, or whatever.
yeah.
So
This is the
yeah.
true destination of all Buddhist
Hmm.
vehicles, whether
Hmm.
they know it or not. I
Hmm.
mean, and Zen has the
Hmm.
same
Hmm.
perspective. You'll
Hmm.
see this in the
Yeah.
Ekayana rhetoric. The one
Right.
vehicle is actually Zen. We're the best representatives of
Right.
it, and
Right.
everything else is just
Yeah.
leading up to this pinnacle. I mean, this is in every Buddhist tradition.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I like to ask, well, best for who? Best when? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've already been touching on this a little, but maybe more in a more directed way. What is going on, and what challenges and opportunities have opened up? You already spoken to this a little within kind of translating everything that we've been talking about into a more modern context for modern practitioners who are coming from a huge plurality of backgrounds and spiritual needs. Maybe they don't even consider their practice to be spiritual. This is a brambly, thorny environment.
Yeah.
With flowers. With flowers.
Yes, I love it. It's multifaceted, yes. Oh, one of the things that Evolving Ground is doing, and a common reason for people to approach Evolving Ground and become involved in the community, is that it provides that platform for exploration. So there is no one single system, and there is nobody in Evolving Ground is doing exactly the same thing as the other people in Evolving Ground. It's a platform for discourse, for dialogue, for looking at across religious traditions as well as all kinds of spiritual traditions, across the Western tradition as well as different Vajrayana traditions. How do these relate with each other? How do certain practices function when you bring them together? So, for example, we have people in Evolving Ground roles. We have contributor roles, solo practitioners, pupil roles, apprentices. And these are different ways of relating with the community. You'll have people in a pupil role who are practicing some Neigong, some Taoism, maybe some Dzogchen, something else, and they're looking at, well, how do these function for me in my life? How do they relate with each other? Am I practicing opening awareness at the moment, or do I want to practice something more jhana-oriented? So there is a sense of self-authorship there that would not be quite so acceptable in a traditional context. And the failure mode of that, it's important to recognize that there is a failure mode in that as well, which is you're simply going around a cycle of, oh, well, whatever I feel like doing, I'll do. And so you're not having any kind of outside perspective that is then informing and changing, that you can relate to as being not coming from me, not my understanding, but something that can implode that and make that completely different. So that, that is, you have to hold those two things and speak with people, communicate with other people, learn from other people as well. But Evolving Ground does provide this place in which it's possible to have that exploration across traditions and talk to people who've got a lot of experience in different traditions as well, without committing, without saying, okay, now I'm going down that path. And some people will move on from Evolving Ground and say, well, yeah, actually, I've found a system, a single system. I found a tradition that just is so what I'm looking for, that I'll move into that. And others will never do that, will never want to. And we're developing our own system and practices as well. And some people are fully engaged in those and taking them on as their practices. But there's no sense that be in Evolving Ground for 10, 20 years and maybe sometimes have an Evolving Ground practice, or sometimes have a practice from a different tradition. And that's totally fine. It's totally fine. It's not a problem. And it's kind of the basis on which we're engaging. Some people have teachers in different traditions. Other people will have me as a teacher or mentors within Evolving Ground. And that works.
Well, I love to hear the pluralism and kind of invitational quality of the Sangha, if you use that term, the community which you're fostering and kind of helping with Jared and everybody involved to create. I know that for me, those kinds of communities of discourse and of friendships, that's been where I felt most at home, even if I do maintain a kind of connection to the more traditional, singularly systematic ways of practice. And as well, in what you're saying, I'm hearing, as human beings, we can't do without systems. It's more a question of contextual appropriateness as to what to apply when, for whom,
and
for what purpose.
Learning how systems function and different parts of systems function in relation with each other as well. I mean, that's large aspect of what a lot of people are doing as they come into evolving ground. And yeah, I mean, that's great. There's both conceptual dialogue and experiential learning. There's learning across the board there. So one of the ways that we look at it is through learning relationships. There are many different forms of learning relationship. It doesn't have to be one fixed form. And the delivery mode is really different as well. So in a traditional context, you're going to have, most likely you'll have a set structure, you'll have a Dharma talk, probably. You'll have somebody, in a Tibetan tradition, you're likely to have somebody sitting on a throne at the front of a group, and then you have people lined up, and they will be listening for a long time, for hours possibly, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask some questions, and then there'll be more talk or whatever. So that's quite a traditional delivery model. So it's not that we wouldn't necessarily include some form of talk or presentation. We used to do that a lot more than we do now, actually. Like I would give a 15-20 minute presentation or discussion starting off thing, and then we'd move into conversation and dialogue and a lot more kind of toing and froing. But now we have multiple forms of learning together. So, and we're not saying, oh, it's the collective Sangha and it's the wisdom of the Sangha. I mean, yes, of course, that happens. There are people with a lot of experience there, and we're drawing on people with experience in different traditions. And there are times when there'll be like one person will be more leading, more of a host of a particular group. But on the whole, we'll have group discussion, and we'll invite people to share their personal experience, and then to look at that and to explore and to understand how to relate with that in different ways. So it's highly interactive. The delivery mode of our gatherings is interactive and very online as well. We do have in-person meetups. We've got a New York group, we've got Colorado groups getting together, we've got European lot in who are meeting up sometimes. So we're moving from having started as an entirely online community just as COVID was taking off. Our first 2 years mostly were all online, and now we're moving into more in-person get-togethers, which is delightful. It's really nice.
Yeah, maybe you could speak, because I know just recently you hosted was it the first two in-person retreats with Evolving Ground?
Yeah,
I
I'm
don't know.
still back fresh from that. It was just fantastic. So we had a trial core community Vajra retreat in January this year, and that was quite small. We just wanted to test having in-person, more formal retreat. And that went very well. We had about 15 people. And so this summer we had our first community retreat followed by a Vajra retreat. The community retreat, we had about, I think, 44 people all together on both those retreats. And the Vajra retreat was a smaller number. There was 28, 30 people, I think. So the community, they had very different flavors. They were in person at Drala Mountain Center in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. Beautiful setting. It was just, it was so lovely. We walked up the mountain to meditate to sunrise.
Oh, wonderful.
Some mornings. It was just glorious. It was so lovely. So the community retreat we had was a lovely, gentle atmosphere. We would have silence overnight, and then opportunity to talk, practice together in the daytimes. One of the things that I have brought from conversation with somebody also involved in traditional Vajrayana, actually 10 years ago or more, is everything is optional. There's absolutely no pressure you come on this retreat, you've got to go to everything. You can self-calibrate. You can decide, okay, I need to take a rest now. I need to get some sleep. Every single session, especially on the community retreat, is self-selected. And so again, another difference in what we're doing, another emphasis that you wouldn't get in traditional Vajrayana, is that we put a lot of emphasis on personal autonomy, on
Yeah.
personal choice, on deciding for yourself whether are you ready for this practice? Are you not ready for this practice? Find out a bit more about it, dip your toe in, decide not to. And so we had a very explicit, this is a good time to leave in the Vajra retreat if you're not interested in this particular practice. And one or two people would get up and say, no, it's not for me today, whatever. So
traditionally there's more of the paternalistic attitude.
right.
You're kind of in this process of devotion and self-surrender to a guru or multiple teachers, and if you're the real good ideal Vajrayana student, you just do whatever your teachers tell you with complete devotion. You view them as a Buddha. You actualize pure vision, and you're set on your way. If you have good gurus, that might work.
It can work. I've seen that work fantastically for some people, and there are some people coming from a more Western cultural perspective and understanding the importance of skepticism as well. And we've got some pages on our site on curious skepticism, skillful disagreement. These are informed by our cultural history, where we find ourselves at the moment, and looking at how that relates to the traditional stance of just being empty, totally empty to the form of your guru, your master. There's certainly a great deal of value in being willing to let go one's personal perspective. But if you don't do that from a place of knowing that you can choose and that you have your autonomy and that you are deciding to do that, then you can get into some tricky situations. Yeah.
As we all know, the litany of scandals and people
it just goes on. Yeah. It just goes on. So learning from that is really important.
While also still making room for that devotional aspect of and self-surrender, if that resonates and is alive for somebody.
Yeah.
So I think that balance is wonderful.
Yeah. So on the Vajra retreat, we had a lot more intensity, a lot more energy, and we ramped up the energy. We had Evolving Grounds got a chud practice, and so we had our chud practice, and the way that chud has been very important for me over the years. I've had a personal chud practice that was highly traditional, and understanding how that can work, where you can get to the intensity, the energy, the intensity of that practice is phenomenal, and yet it's really not available to many people who are not wanting to go into one particular system or take on a very traditional form. Chud should be mind-blowing. It should be shocking. The way that it functions is utterly it can be horrific as well. Very challenging practice, very challenging, and it's a fully embodied experience. And I think the way that would have functioned in traditional circumstances has kind of been lost a little bit. Like you see these YouTube videos of people like engaging in the chud practice and going on and on and on. They look so bored.
It's very rote, and some people look like they're falling asleep.
It just looks.
And it's like, wait, you're supposed to be severing your arms and feeding them to liberate demons who appear. I mean, that sounds, and you see somebody's drifting off.
So at very best, you could say, well, there's a difference between what's going on externally and what you see and what's happening internally. So in the Evolving Ground chud, we have got those aligned such that what is going on externally, what is going on in your entire body is absolutely aligned with the practice method itself. And it functions in a highly transformative way. We had some people engaged with that practice, like actually most people who were engaged with the practice said, this is the most transformative single experience that I've had in decades. Seriously. Wow. It was very challenging, and absolute kudos to the people who did go there. Utterly inspiring seeing them immerse themselves in that practice and come out the other end and just and be moved and transformed. And yeah, so very moving being a part of that, seeing that take place.
I mean, yeah. I'm reassured to hear you say everything that you've been saying, especially this piece about the bringing the intensity and the vitality of the chud practice forward for people in perhaps a more accessible, and I don't mean that in a kind of watered down context as that might be seen, but you're making that available to people. Yes, delighted.
Yeah, and at the same time, we have to think a lot about safety.
Yeah.
When we had preparation sessions, 90-minute preparation session running up to that each day, where we're looking at how do you keep yourselves absolutely safe in this? And there are no guarantees, obviously. The more that you increase energetic practice, the more risk you're taking. So entering into a practice like chud, knowing and understanding what the risks are that you're taking, knowing and understanding that you can actually decide not to do this, and having a little taste of what it might be like. So we had, say, a 5-minute dipping your toe in, and that was pretty extreme for some people as well. So we're not talking about a very traditional form here, where you're entering into a bell, a drum, a visualization practice, but you're sitting in your seat. I mean, yes, there were aspects of the practice that involve sitting still, being in silence as well. But very, very different in the form of the method, the delivery of the method, utterly different to traditional practice.
Fascinating, but I don't want to inquire more. We got to keep some mystique for the people to go and seek you in a evolving ground out.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Well, is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to? Well, you go. Something came up for me, but
go ahead.
What's the best case scenario here? For evolving ground, for this kind of emerging metasystemic attitude that I see percolating through various communities and acquaintances.
I think there are multiple different views there. One view is that any system arises in context and is relevant to a particular culture or group, particular circumstance at any one time, and then that is going to have its, reach its peak. It's going to be highly relevant, and then gradually it's going to tail off and become empty of meaning, less relevant over a couple of generations or whatever. So that is one possibility. That's one view that some people will take. That's totally fine. The way that I think when I'm writing, when I'm bringing things together, I'm thinking about our great-great-grandchildren or great-great-great-grandchildren. I'm thinking, like, what kind of society are they going to be born into? And I think that it will be even more incoherent than what we have now. We're inheriting systems, we're inheriting infrastructure, we're relying on social circumstances that actually no longer exist, and already there are cracks in the seams. Already people are finding it difficult to navigate and relate. And 100 years time, 150 years time, our descendants are going to be, they're going to have less to hang on to and less available to navigate. So every time I bring something into being, every time I write, I'm thinking of them. I'm thinking of showing how it is possible to find coherence in a sea of flotsam and jetsam, showing how important it is to be able to think systematically, to understand how something functions, how a particular method functions, or how a circumstance gives rise to a method, how things work, not only in religious circumstances, but how things work in relation to our relationships, our society. How do we bring these practices and understand them as relevant? So I have them in mind when I'm creating with Evolving Ground. But who knows?
That's really wonderful.
Who knows what's going to happen? Yeah.
Who knows? Yeah. I think sometimes I wonder whether we aren't in this decade, this prior decade, in these coming decades, if we aren't at the turn of something like another axial age in terms of the transformation of culture. And that's kind of
could go in different ways, couldn't it? Yeah.
Not much stasis to be found in any system that is the undergirding structures of our societies are coming apart in significant ways.
This is so relevant to Buddhist Tantra, because Buddhist Tantra grew and became relevant in exactly that kind of cultural and social upheaval. I mean, in some ways, it was a response to the breakdown of monastic, institutional, universal, like very widely culturally stable systems that began to break and disintegrated into chaos, both in India and in Tibet. We had a lot of that, these cultural melting pots where things suddenly exploded, and warring factions, and Tantra became valuable in that kind of a context. So seeing the parallels now and seeing how the way that it functions is highly relevant. It's extremely worldly oriented. It's not about heading off into a pure land, a nirvāṇa. It's oriented towards having results in this social circumstance.
In this circumstance, in this body.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not forestalling freedom.
Yeah. And with our family, with our friends, with our contemporaries.
And civic and public engagement, all of that. Including everything.
Yeah.
Well, I can't think of a better way to conclude than on that note.
Fantastic.
The relevance of all of this.
Yeah. It's been really interesting. Thank you, Wystan.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Charlie. And mayhaps we'll do another one of these. There was,
that'd be great.
I felt like at every junction there were branching trees
More
that we could have followed.
It
was difficult to narrow in. But that was all to the good. So thanks so much for coming on. Cool. And if people want to find you and Evolving Ground, where should they go?
So 2 sites we could maybe link with the podcast: evolvingground.org. So that is evolving, 2 G's in the middle, evolvingground.org. And my personal site is Vajrayana now. So Vajrayana, as in Vajrayana, all one word, now.com.
Okay. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in. Thanks again, Charlie, and we'll see you next time.
Wonderful. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.